I don't know if this happens for everyone, but I know for me, there's been a little bit of a tension around it because there's the mythos of if you keep reaching out to them, if you keep that connection going, then you're not getting over it. You're not letting go. You're not moving on. Right.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't want to do those things. I don't want to lose Edward. I don't want to let go. I don't want to move on. I'm going to move forward, but I'm going to move forward with him in this way,
Yeah.
not in all the ways I had hoped,
Yeah.
but in this way. And that's a gift to me and to him.
Yeah. Welcome back to another episode of Full-Time Grievers.
Yeah, glad to be back here together.
Likewise. So today I will be interviewing you about your personal journey with grief to give listeners an idea as to how you got here to this day, to this speaking about grief, as well as to give listeners learning, because I think that there's so much learning that can happen from just listening to people's stories. There's so many life hacks and things that we like to share, but actually just listening to stories can provide so much experience for people. So I just want to emphasize that from the beginning.
Yeah, I love that, like the ancient wisdom of story.
Yeah, exactly. So why don't we start by you just sharing about your personal journey and relationship with grief?
Okay, yeah, yes. So similar to you and what you were sharing with us, Selysa, my first experience with grief wasn't actually because of death. My parents broke up when I was about 6 months old. I actually didn't even see my dad again until I was about 6 years old, 6 years
Mm-hmm.
old, and then only sporadically throughout my growing up. But I didn't know it was a grieving process then, but now I certainly recognize the pining and the questioning and all the layers and layers and layers of feelings that I went through as a grieving process there. But I think even though I didn't know it was, there's a way in which it kind of set me up to have this kind of foundational understanding in things not going the way we had planned and that we would hoped or that they might have otherwise, and the way that can open us to grief or sorrow. And then there were, other, I want to call them tiny grieving processes. Maybe that's not the right way to put it, but, lesser grieving, that's still not the way to put it. Other grieving processes in my youth that I now kind of recognize. But the next loss of a person was when I was 16 and my grandma died. And it was at the end of a long bout, and even we got more time with her than we expected as she was fighting cancer and multiple types of cancer that eventually took her out. But it was this real slow descend and a real change in the person that I knew growing up. I was very, very close to my grandma. We would sit together in her chair when I would come over and visit, and like I would help her in the kitchen, and we were just like two peas in a pod. And losing her was a tremendous blow to me. It was like losing a second mom. But because of the tools I had and because of my understanding about grieving at the time and because of where I was as a teenager, I almost completely ignored it. I didn't process it or get help processing it. I didn't go to any of the services. I didn't visit her grave. I was just like, I just closed that door as best as one can, like we
Mm-hmm.
know, and I certainly now know that we can close the door, but we don't do anything with the feelings that are on the other side of that door when we close it. They'll just wait.
Yeah.
And wait they did.
They'll incubate.
Yeah, that's a great way to put it. Incubating.
Yeah.
I definitely see now, looking back, how vestiges and streams or threads or roots of the grieving that I didn't do around my grandma have come forth more recently. Then in college, my first year in college, I had a good friend who died in a weird accident. It was like a candle that got knocked over when they were asleep and caught the place on fire, and they didn't get out in time. And that was the first time. There was a person, it was in my friend group, and we were definitely friends, but it wasn't like one of my closer people. But it was still this way in which it really opened me to, oh, there's this thing that happens whether you intend it or not, or can happen when we lose someone, and you go through a process and you experience change.
So it was like your first reality check that death doesn't always come at a ripe old age.
Right, for sure, for sure.
Yeah.
And there was that sense of like, wait, something's off here. This isn't how it's supposed to go. Heath, our friend, was stolen. And that's
Mm-hmm.
what we would say to each other
Mm-hmm.
as we were grieving it. But very much unlike the process I went through with my grandma, I really gave myself time for it, and I leaned into it. I blew off a bunch of classes in my freshman year, and I learned how to paint. I started painting, and I painted kind of ferociously for a little while as a way to just try to move with some of what was happening to me. And I think it was probably also this first time I started to think about how we actually move emotional energy. That it's not just, oh, look, someone's having a feeling, but that there's this whole thing, like process that we engage in with every feeling, but especially in a grieving process that has like some beginning, even if you can't tell where it begins, and it has some middle, even if you can't tell where the middle is, and it has some not end necessarily, but like a closing for a time, even if you're not necessarily sure where that is, like this kind of
Mm-hmm.
arc of movement. And again, the first time I really understood the way in which grieving or going through a grieving process is, I want to say synonymous with, but at least travels along with personal change. Right? We change as we go through that process. My grandma's partner, my grandfather, and I think you can even feel the difference in the relationship and how I called her grandma, I called him grandfather exclusively.
Yeah.
But he died right before my eldest daughter was born. And again, I didn't get to attend to that grieving process at all. I didn't get to go to any of the services. I didn't get to go and see his grave until many years later because I had this baby on the way. And we didn't, my partner at the time was on bed rest because there were issues. And so we weren't even sure exactly how soon our daughter might come. So I couldn't risk being gone at all. And so it was another place where the grieving process was really just truncated and interrupted. And then I had this baby and this whole baby life to begin working on. And so I, again, had that experience of the door being closed, but then later finding that everything that was behind that door was still there.
Mm-hmm.
Then I'd say my next biggest experience with loss was again not a death, but as a newish parent, I got divorced. And it was such a devastating blow to my hopes and my plans, and such a perfect match for my worst fears that I absolutely experienced that as a really deep grieving process, probably the deepest grieving process I had yet experienced.
Mm-hmm.
And it was sort of in a blind and ignorant way, but I was able to give myself over to that grieving process. And through that, again, even though I wasn't conscious of it and I wasn't as intentional as I would recommend people be, there were some significant insights that I got.
When you say a blind and ignorant way, do you mean that you had no choice but to grieve because it was so in your face, it was unignorable?
Yeah, and I just mean like I didn't know that I was in. I didn't intend, and I wasn't like consciously choosing to. Okay, now I'm going to give myself over to this because it's a grieving process, and you need to do that. I was
Mm-hmm.
just so overwhelmed with the level of emotion, so felt such devastation
Mm-hmm.
at the loss that the grieving process just kind of took the wheel.
Mm-hmm.
So I'd say blindly, ignorantly gave it to myself, you know, because I didn't choose it, but I was so destabilized that all I could do was allow the grieving. Like even though I didn't enter it intentionally and wasn't being mindful of my process, there were still, because I was giving myself time for it, there were these huge insights that came through and pretty potent personal healing. And even a new way of relating to feelings and feelings processing, because I saw where I went and I came back and I was like, wait, this disturbs all of the mythos that I've understood about feelings, where if you go in there, you're never going to come back from those really painful feelings. So you need to kind of like protect yourself and stop yourself. Because I wasn't able to do that, I really saw, again, this kind of arc of healing that happens with feelings, where when you really open to them, they do blossom, they do get bigger, it does get scarier, but then they always also, they crescendo, but they also decrescendo, right? They always taper back off in some way. And I think also it was that process that took me to the trailhead, I'd say, that led me to the work that I now do and the creation of the Center for Emotional Education that I went on to found. If I hadn't gone through that, I probably wouldn't be doing anything that I'm doing now.
Wow.
There were other losses, even connected with that, of community or work or plans, even property, which came with their own grieving processes. But it wasn't until I lost my brother last year that I really came to understand what I would say is a full scope, not the full scope, but a full scope of traumatic loss and the kind of grieving that can come from that. And it's really been in this year that I've been watching myself and mindfully looking and intending to see how all the emotional processing tools that I've been studying and using with clients and even teaching in our programs for the last 17 years, how they work in a grieving process. Mm-hmm. But also really learning firsthand what it means to go through that personal journey and transformation of a deep grieving process myself. Because when I went through it in college with Heath, there was this sense of like, oh, look, I'm becoming this artist as a part of this process. There's a change. And I really leaned into that. Like, I'm becoming this new person. And here it was more like, oh, shit, like I can't stop myself from changing because of what I'm going through. And I say, oh, shit, because I didn't plan that. It wasn't like, championing it. And there are some parts of that change that have been really painful. And I'm still integrating and still learning how to work with. I do think one of the things I've learned is that grieving is just such a different animal than most other emotional processes, even though many of the same tools are highly useful in both.
Mm-hmm. Wow. The word that comes to mind is beautiful. I mean it in an artistic way. I don't mean it in a conventional way. Like that is like the beauty of a rainy day or the beauty of a blizzard. It's almost as though it's just witnessing your growth through grieving is kind of like that beauty of a storm.
I really like that you're using that analogy. My brother really loved storms and stormy days. And it was kind of a point of conversation throughout our lives about sun versus rain.
Wow, that's super beautiful. I want to touch on, you said that when your grandma
and grandfather
and grandfather passed away, that you shut those feelings out, but you found them waiting for you later. When did you find them waiting for you, and when did you address that?
Yeah. So I mean that in two ways. Mm-hmm. One, I think there's a sense of the volume of emotion that I've been dealing with in the loss of my brother, which I definitely relate to because he was like my closest person. Like my relationship with him was unlike any relationship I've ever had before or since. And I don't think I'll ever have a relationship with another human like that. Mm-hmm. So there's that piece, I saw a volume of feelings that was connected to that, but then tapping into it and feeling there's history here. There's longer painful feelings here than just this situation. And so that's one level of having the sense that going through this process has opened doors to other grieving processes that I'd kind of closed off or compartmentalized or held away from myself.
So just in the last year, since your brother passed away, you're now grieving grandma and grandfather.
Very much so. And the second way I'd say that I know that that's the case. So one is the volume. Two is the sense that in my grieving processes, one of the tools I use is a historical review of the feeling that I'm sitting with, and where else have I felt this feeling? And many times, through many different flavors of feeling and different emotions I've been sitting with in my grieving process, I've gone back to those two places where my grandfather died or where my grandma died, as at least on the way, or as part of the historical lineage of these feelings. And so there's been this sense of finally getting to let out some of those feelings that I've been holding on to, and a sort of a retracing back and remembering, oh, there was anger when my grandma died, and I just didn't attend to it. I got drunk and I broke some shit, and then I never looked at it again. Same with my grandfather. There was this real deep, because I wanted to, but I didn't get to because my baby daughter was on the way. I didn't get to go and attend to it, even though at that point in my life, I was ready to, I was willing to, I wanted to. So there was this sense of that kind of yearning. And there's the yearning that I think part of a grieving process, that is yearning to have our person back, or yearning for this to be different. But there's also that yearning for coming to terms with it, integrating it, right? Yearning to like engage with the process, that I think sometimes comes up for many of us. That if that gets stilted or closed off in some way, it stays.
Mm-hmm.
And there have been other feelings like that I've recognized. Oh, some of the history of this feeling is in those places.
Wow. Wow. What a beautiful lineage of emotion.
Yeah. Especially when we can think of it that way.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Like your relationship with that emotion through the arc of your own life.
Yeah. Yeah.
What do you think is the biggest learning that you've taken away from grief?
I should say I'm just terrible at picking favorites. And in grieving processes, I think there's so many opportunities for learning, although I'm really hesitant to mention that to anyone who's going through a grieving process, because I don't want to, it's not a thing to give a platitude about, or try to brush past someone's grieving to say, well, at least you're learning so much. Right? I definitely don't want to do
Mm-hmm.
that. But I do think there's a lot of learning available.
Mm-hmm.
One of the things that's really stood out for me is about how grieving isn't really like other emotional processes, right? I'd heard that, and I'd actually even told my clients that before, clients I'd worked with who were going through grieving processes, but I didn't really know the half of it. I feel some embarrassment about how kind of easily I would say that to a client. Well, grieving is this longer process than lots of other feelings, and there's layers, and you got to go through the layers, and you got to give it time. I feel some embarrassment about how much I would say that without really knowing it. And now I have that really deep embodied sense of the way in which grieving is, and we've talked about it or will in other podcasts that you and I have done, where we talk about how grieving is like being at the beach, right? At the shore with these waves that just come again and again and again. This process with Edward and losing my brother has been where I've really learned an embodied sense of that length. I think another thing is the way in which, I want to say deep grieving, but probably any grieving process really does change the griever. Our brains become different, our personalities can change, our outlook on everything is altered, even if only for a time, but I think maybe not just for a time. I think we can experience tremendous, tremendous growth through a grieving process, or healing through any trauma. And I do think of grieving as a kind of trauma,
Mm-hmm.
or I think there's traumatic loss that we can experience. But pretty much, I think that healing, the learning, the growth that can happen, post-traumatic growth they refer to, I think that can really only happen if we work through the process intentionally, if we're
Yeah.
actually tending to it.
So it sounds like you had a really theoretical and philosophical understanding of grief previously. And that's what you relied on to support your clients with it. And you don't have the life experience that you don't have.
Right.
And now you have a true embodied, incredibly deep understanding of what that process actually can look like
And feel like,
and
you know,
feel like, which is
yeah.
enriching your ability to hold space for it in others.
I think so much. Yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely. 100%. Like night and day, even. I mean, I've been good at emotional processing and co-processing and supporting people, and I've worked with grievers, and that's where my understanding of grievers has come from before,
Mm-hmm.
largely. But it's really different once you've walked in those shoes, right? Like with
Yeah.
anything.
Yeah. This episode is brought to you by the Center for Emotional Education and Sacramento Reiki Center, where we support full-time grievers every day. Many of our clients have tried everything and it still hasn't been enough. After our work together, they gain the tools and skills that they need to navigate their grief on their own. You can get more information at sacramentoreikicenter.com and centerforoemotionaleducation.com. What do you think has been the hardest part about grief?
Let's see if I can get through this part. Yeah, there's been a lot of hard parts in grieving Edward in particular. The nature of this particular loss, being someone who's just so intimately close to me and who's so foundational to my understanding of myself and my sense of safety and belonging in the world,
Mm-hmm.
but also because it was so sudden. He had a heart condition that he didn't tell me about because I'm sure he didn't want me to worry or try to make him do something about it. But he died quite suddenly, and I didn't get to see his body. I didn't get to be with him before he was cremated. I didn't get to have any of the ashes. So there's a sense of some of the normal processes that would support a grieving process. I didn't get to have. I think those have made it harder. I also think, generally speaking, not having enough time or money to be on grief leave, to just like
Mm-hmm.
stop working for a period of time, as people have done historically, and as cultures have supported historically, and some still do with a kind of grief leave. We don't have that in our country, and so there's really been a sense of not having enough time to just devote to the process.
Mm-hmm.
So I've had to get pretty good at finding the time and making the time, but I think that's been a really difficult part, and in the sense of like regularly having that sense of like, I'm not done, but I've got to keep going. I've got to do something else. I've got to go to work. I've got to be on a call. I've got to show up. I've got to take care of my
Mm-hmm.
kids. I've got to feed the animals. I've got, like there's
Yeah.
life just keeps happening. Right.
Yeah.
And I think that has been the hardest part, the navigation of time and other responsibilities of life,
Yeah.
working with that by being intentional about giving it time.
Wouldn't it be wonderful
Yeah.
if we lived in a society with 1 year
Yeah.
of community support
Yeah.
where your only job is to grieve?
Yeah. And I love that you pick a year. I think of, you know, I don't know if it's true, but the sort of mythical Scandinavians who supposedly gave a year to be amongst the ashes to those who were newly grieving, where all they had to do was tend the fire in their longhouse, right? Something like that. And I like that you picked a year in part because we don't know anything about what's happening to us in the grieving process until there's been at least a year, right? I mean, I
Mm-hmm.
think we're going through so many things and so many things are happening, but it's only with at least a year that we can have any kind of perspective on that process.
Mm-hmm.
And then I also think a year would be awesome if we could give people that, because currently we pathologize people or who are taking or pathologize the process that people are taking. If they take longer than 6 months, we start
Yeah.
saying, oh, that's complicated or that's prolonged grief. And I
Mm-hmm.
don't know that that's really that useful of a way to designate it.
I agree with that completely. So, how do you think that you have worked through or overcome, or perhaps haven't overcome, these challenges of grief?
Yeah. I keep kind of pecking at it or like tucking it in a little bit. It's been trying to be intentional with the time, trying to be intentional with giving myself the time. And so, my work week is such that I regularly have a little bit of time on Friday afternoons, and then Saturday and Sunday, where I typically don't have work projects or things like that scheduled, that I have been really intentional about preserving and protecting if I need to allow for some grieving, or even if I just have a need to allow resting from having been focused on doing everything else but grieving throughout the week. I've protected these and preserved hours at a time on the weekends, especially to give myself just room if something needs to come up. And I've found that my nervous system is kind of attenuated to that in a weird way, maybe not a weird way, such that I can feel like my grief waves have kind of synchronized to that rhythm a little bit, such that my system will see, oh, okay, we got a doorway coming or we got a window coming where we can do some of this. Let's go ahead and start turning the turbines on or whatever, like generating the wave. So it's been very, very useful to have regular set aside time, even if I'm not, let's say, feeling sadness or feeling grief or feeling sorrow, but maybe I'm just feeling, I don't know, lethargy. To have time and space where I know I'll be able to give to that has been really useful to me.
So it sounds like you have been practicing really, really strong boundaries.
I knew you were
Like
going to
you're
say that. Yeah.
protecting your time from other people. So I'm just curious some of the things that you have said no to in order to protect this time.
Yeah. That's a great question, because I think that's really where the rubber meets the road for a lot of folks. Like,
Yeah.
it's one thing to theorize, okay, yeah, I'll give myself time on the weekends. But I think two things can happen on the weekends then. It's like we get there and we're like, well, I'm actually feeling good, so I don't want to ruin that, right? And so we
Mm-hmm.
don't think of that as giving ourselves the time for the grieving. But even when I'm feeling, lots of the feelings that we prefer to be feeling, whatever you call them, contentment or pleasure or joy or love in particular, on those weekend spots, one of the boundaries I hold for myself is I still give that time, even if the feelings are pleasurable feelings, the time is devoted to my grieving process. So if I'm feeling love, I'm writing a love poem to Edward, right? Or I'm going on a drive and singing with him at the top of my lungs,
Mm-hmm.
something like that. The other thing I think is, yeah, you have to be willing to say no to some things, even some things that you normally do, even some things that give you a sense of normalcy, even some things that you might otherwise put in the category of being good for you. I mean, would be good for you, but that take the time. So not avoided, I've said no to going out on the weekend sometimes when I've been invited, even to some things I wanted to do. Like I wanted to see my friend's comedy show, but I didn't, because I was giving myself time for this grieving process right now.
Mm-hmm.
I've given up dog walks. My partner and I do a dog walk every single day, at least once. And it's a nice long, like 45 minutes to an hour, where we get to be with each other and chat. And we talk about whatever we're talking about, or we don't talk about anything. We just are enjoying ourselves out there. I've given up numerous dog walks on the weekends, even though it's quite precious to me, so that I can just be quiet and be still and be here with it, whatever it is in my grieving process. I've said no to working more, even though sometimes that would be really useful for me or for my clients. I've said no to creative projects that I would otherwise love to be involved in. I'm often involved in a theater production each year. I didn't do that last year at the time when that would normally happen. Things like that, even some things that have been quite important to me, I've said, well, at least for now, I'm going to give myself a timeout or a pass from doing that, because this process is important to me, and and because Edward is important to me. I think that's a bottom line as well. Like, the grieving process is so vital to me surviving, healing through the wounding that I'm experiencing in this season. But it's also time that I give and I'm devoting in this season because my person is worth it.
Hmm.
It means that much to me.
I love that you call it a season. It's
Yeah.
beautiful. Where is the balance between not isolating and saying no to things?
Yeah, I think that's a personal one. And I think it's important for us to investigate, and I think we won't always get it right. But I think there's an intelligence to the grieving process. I think there's an intelligence to emotional processing in general. I think our system has a lean toward healing and is looking for how to help us heal, even if we wind up doing adaptations or sort of taking on processes or ways of managing that aren't actually healthy for us. I think there's still, it's because our system has a lean toward healing, a lean toward
Hmm.
integration. I love that word, integration, by the way. I think that's a really important piece for grieving, because part of what we're doing is helping our brains and our nervous system learn what happened to us in the loss. Our person is gone. What does that mean? My brain's been predicting that they're going to be there, and they've been there thousands and thousands and thousands of times in our lives. What does it mean to me in my life and my nervous system and my existence that they're not there? And are they still not there? And are they still not there? And are they still not there? And so there's this real deep and important process that we have to allow to happen in us. And I think there is an intelligence to it. And so my lean in general, I'm overusing that word, but my lean in general is to give myself room for the process. So if I don't feel like going out, or if I've decided that I'm not going out because I'm giving room to my process, I'm going to trust that for now. Because I also do have times where what feels right to me is to go and get some hugs, to go and be with, especially my partner, but to go and be with my other people, to reach out to other people that knew Edward and to connect with them and to be with them and to not hold myself away from them. And so honoring both flows, I think, has been important to me. I think if I had the sense that I've gone off in a direction where I've now started to eschew connection, I guess there would be an internal inquiry around that. Like, what's coming up for me around that? What are the feelings I have around that? What is that serving me? In what ways am I using that isolation or removal from my people? And try to get a sense of if there is some service in that, or if that is actually a way I'm trying to protect myself from discomfort. In isolation, one of the things that can be occurring for a grieving person is there's a level of protection that we're trying to preserve. Sometimes it's for us. We're just safer over here in our little zone, and we're not having to interact with other people or interact in situations or environments or with things or people or places that would activate our grief. Some of us are trying to preserve our or protect ourselves in that way. And then I also think some of us are trying to protect others. We don't want to bring our storm cloud to their parade or their picnic or their otherwise great day. So we can sort of hold
Hmm.
ourselves away a little bit sometimes
Yeah.
in that respect. But I think that feels different than I want to go on the dog walk. I'm not doing the dog walk today because I'm preserving time for my grief. I think there's a way in which that we experience that differently inside us.
Yeah. What would you say to someone who they are also still have to work full time? They're like, okay, I'm setting aside every Saturday from 12 to 3 p.m. to dedicate to my grieving process. But then they find that during that time, they're just getting sucked into Netflix
Mm.
the whole time. What would you say to
Oh,
them on how to use that time?
yeah. I think that's a really, really powerful inquiry because avoidance is a very normal and natural part of healing, especially through a grieving process. So some level of that, some level of, I'm just going to not look at it for right now, is super supportive. And I have hesitance around saying that because I don't want to be inviting people to just like, okay, like just go binge anything, binge watch or binge drink or binge eat to get away from it. Like I'm not trying to prescribe that.
Mm-hmm.
I want to be able to protect a little bit of room for each of us to have around those moments where the right thing for us is to check out a little bit.
Mm-hmm.
And for some of that's a regular need. I need to just turn this off for a time and do something else. And for some of us, that's like a period that we go through. I definitely had a full month. I can track it to the day. A full month when Edward first passed, where there was a lot of survival reactivity, is the way I relate to that, checking out, and a kind of flight, and a useful kind of flight. For me, there was a lot more freeze than flight. I just like went numb. I went blank. I went quiet. I had to sleep a lot. Or I was in fight. I was like planning. I was trying to do something. I was trying to make something happen. I was racing down to Alabama to save his cat. And then I was racing back down there to make a celebration of his life happen. And I was like really fighting my way through that. And I'm just describing that to say that I think there can be a real period of when something like avoidance is just what we need. It's what's happening for us, and it's the right thing for us. As our nervous system is titrating our experience of slowing down and being purposeful in our experience of this tremendous thing that's happening to us. And when we find ourselves leaning more and more and more and more on that, especially in the time or space that we've tried to give ourselves for our grieving, then I definitely think it's worth investigating if there are other things that we can start trying to do. So
Mm-hmm.
if we've been doing a month of, well, from 12 to 3 in my grieving time on Saturdays, I've just been watching comedy, then like after the month or so, or when we come to the fact, like this is what I keep doing with this time, that I think that's an opportunity that our nervous system, our brain is bringing us to see if we can do something different.
Mm-hmm.
And the something different might just be, 5 minutes of thinking of my lost loved one, or 5 minutes of naming the feelings that I am aware of, or that I was last aware of about that are coming up around the grieving. And I say naming the feelings because it's not going to be just grief, right? It's going to be the whole slew of feelings that can come up. Pretty much every feeling that any one of us can have can come up during a grieving process, right? So,
Mm-hmm.
you know, maybe if it's only naming those before we then go back to watching the Netflix, or going and watching more comedy, or 5-10 minutes of writing something about our loved one, taking these little opportunities to work with that natural titration that's happening inside us. Like with my story, if our only strategy is to close the door, well, we have the door and we've been able to close it. It's just that everything behind the door will still be there later.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's can be an unfortunate, maybe I should put air quotes around unfortunate, part of the natural healing lean of our nervous system, that we can compartmentalize. We can kind of close off for a time, but like a splinter that heals over instead of us pulling it out, it stays in there, and eventually it's going to fester, and eventually it's going to need to have maybe even a bigger process to get out of us. And if we don't do that, then we're going to experience more pain, inflammation, illness, maybe
Mm-hmm.
even early death.
Mm-hmm.
So if we're catching ourselves, I think that's a powerful signal. Okay, maybe we're ready for something else. And then when we
Yeah.
can, just taking little bite-sized chunks of that time to try a different strategy.
Yeah. That's beautiful. Thank you.
I'm so glad you asked that, really, because I think avoidance, sleep, distraction, numbing out, just not tuning into it is such a useful and normal part of, and just say part of, not the whole thing, but part of a grieving process.
Yeah, and that's the real distinction, isn't it? Is if whoever's listening to this can self reflect on, is this my whole process or is this a part of my process? And if it is the whole process for months and months on end, then that's worth reanalyzing.
Yeah.
And if it's a part of the process, cool, honor it.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
What is a blessing that came as a surprise to you that you received through grieving?
I love this question here. I definitely think we, as people supporting grievers, we too frequently, too early go to a question like this. But I do think it is important to reflect on at some point what is coming to me in this process. And I
Mm-hmm.
do think that there are lots of benefits. Maybe benefits isn't the right way to put it, but blessings, gifts,
Mm-hmm.
growth, learnings, things that we can glean from it. One of the more surprising things for me, well, I felt a lot of surprise, but in thinking about me and the way I work and the relationship I have with Edward, it's not terribly surprising. But 2 days after I found out that he'd passed, showed up in my guidance when I went to do, as some of our listeners may know, and as more of them will know after I say it, I do shamanic work. I'm a shamanic practitioner in addition to the emotional practice and work that I do. And so, as part of my own shamanic work, energetic work, I do journeying, and I journey to connect with my own guidance in a particular space and in a particular way. And I went to my guidance to essentially get support with the grieving and with trying to, like, really just trying to stay alive after I found out Edward passed. And there he was in spirit form, like a new arrival in my guidance, along with other ancestors I have, along with other guides I have that I don't know if they're particularly related to me or not, like in my lineage, but I think of as in my ancestry. And he was just there. And I was like, what are you doing here? And we got to have this really beautiful and amazing and powerful conversation. And he's continued to be there. And it's been this really fascinating thing for me. I've never read about it. I've never heard about it. I have no experience with it in any other shamanic practice or from any other person that I've connected with in a grieving process. But I think it's possible for all of us. I've gotten to see and continue to be in contact with, I call it spirit Ed because it is different from earthly Edward, but with the part of him that is now available to me as an ancestor, as a guide. And I've not only gone to him for support, gone to him for guidance, gone to him to actually channel through me to help me do things, but I've also gotten to see him change in that venue and in that form. So he's gotten new skills. He's gotten new, like, things that he can do, new ways of talking and thinking and speaking that I know are still him and are connected to him, but are a result of this part of him being in that space and me getting to continue to be in contact with him in that space. So it's been really like the biggest, most powerful blessing I could possibly imagine or hope for. Right. And that's even, with someone who doesn't normally do favorites. Like, that's just like, to have that as a boon and to be able to rely on him, call on him, talk to him, get his support in actually grieving his loss or him passing, because I haven't lost him, has been just such a unparalleled gift.
That's so beautiful. That reminds me of the episode we recorded of opening to the love of the lost one. And it seems as though you actually made that connection extremely early on, 2 days after the passing,
Yeah.
with your brother. And for anyone listening who wants to have that connection for themselves, and of course, it will look different than your connection because it's about the relationship evolving, tune into that episode of Opening to Love of the Lost One.
Yeah. Yeah. I think however you're able to do that, it's such an important and useful part of going through the process of grieving
Hmm.
our loved one, to keep reaching out, to keep connecting, to keep our ties to them vital and current.
Hmm. And I want to also touch back on what you mentioned, that you hesitate to bring up blessings in grieving processes. And that's because there's so much spiritual bypassing that happens in all emotional processes. And I think I just want to reiterate that what you're trying to say is that we're not looking for blessings as silver linings in order to ignore the hardship of emotions that are there.
Yeah. So beautifully put. Exactly, exactly, exactly. Yes.
And that sometimes when people receive blessings or post traumatic growth, they can reflect on and kind of ignore all of the negative and hardship that happened. And they think, like, oh, that was so worth it because now I am experiencing this. And then other people have completely different experiences where they're like, no, that sucked. And now I have this, and this is good. And that I personally believe that both realities should be held in reverence, and that it is healthy to hold incredibly contrasting sensations and emotions all at the same time. So we can have the devastation, the horror, the shock, the really, really intense things, and we can have the blessings and the gifts of, the, in your case, the incredible love and him joining your guides. That those both get to be true at the same time. We don't need to choose the positive one because that's what spiritual people around us tell us to do.
Yeah. Yes. I think that's such an important way to put it. Yeah. And I would even say that I think often there's this orientation toward, well, what's the blessing so that we'll make this grieving easier? And I think
Mm-hmm.
we can trust that the blessings will show up if we just give ourselves the opportunity for the process.
Mm-hmm.
We don't have to work
Mm-hmm.
hard for that.
No.
And I would also put it, like one of the other blessings that came to me was that I did get to go to those doors that I had closed on my grandfather's grieving and my grandma's grieving, and open them and release a lot of that emotion, and heal old and even current emotional wounds
Mm-hmm.
by giving myself to the process, not by racing toward the blessing.
If you could give advice to someone who had a similar loss to you, so for example, who lost a sibling suddenly, or just to your past self.
I guess there's a few angles to it. One is just to know that this is part of you now, right? We talk about it in the waves of grief episode, but like you live with this now. This is just part of you, and it will change, and it will develop, and it will move, but it doesn't go away. You just get more used to it.
Mm-hmm.
It's sort of a dismal sentence, but it's also like it's hopeful. Like you don't have to have the goal of I got to get back to where I was, or I got to get back to normal, or I've got to get past this grief, and so I can get back to me. You just
That lands so hard for me.
know that you're different.
Yeah.
I also think along those same lines, though, like knowing that this is just part of you now, knowing that this isn't going to go away, and your job is not to try to get it to go away, but to just get good at it. I think knowing that you don't have to stop reaching out to your loved one.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know if this happens for everyone, but I know for me, there's been a little bit of a tension around it because there's the mythos of if you keep reaching out to them, if you keep that connection going, then you're not getting over it. You're not letting go. You're not moving on. Right.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't want to do those things. I don't want to lose Edward. I don't want to let go. I don't want to move on. I'm going to move forward, but I'm going to move forward with him in this way,
Yeah.
not in all the ways I had hoped,
Yeah.
but in this way. And that's a gift to me and to him.
Yeah.
So yeah, I would say don't try to make yourself have to get back to normal. Don't try and talk yourself into thinking that this is just something you have to get over, and don't talk yourself out of remaining connected to your loved one. in whatever ways are right for you. It doesn't have to be like a shamanic thing, it could be with the way the sunlight comes in the window, or it could be a particular flower that they loved, or color that that they loved, or just talking to them occasionally. I still leave voice messages for Edward on Messenger. I used to do it on his phone, but his phone got disconnected, so I just found this other way that I can still do it, and I do it every week. And then I look for messages back from him too. So it doesn't have to be a magical woo-woo thing if that's not your jam. But look for those mundane, normal, everyday, all the time ways that you are already still connected to your loved one. That'd be my main advice.
That's beautiful, and I think that's such a powerful note to end on.
Hey, thanks for listening to Full-Time Grievers. Please like this video, subscribe, and hit that notification bell so you find out when we release the next episode. If you have thoughts or questions about what we shared, please leave them in the comments below. And if this episode made you think of someone, we invite you to send it to them. They could probably use it. Also, don't forget to get your free Receiving Support While Grieving guide in the show notes below.